What is up, you guys? I hope you're doing well. I'm Fuentes, and today's video is going to be a very basic one. We're going to go into the basic corrections in Lightroom, what Lightroom is in general. It's going to be dedicated for beginners, so if you're a more advanced editor, just consider skipping this video in general. But if you're just starting out and want to start editing your photos, you can go through this video and hopefully you can get some knowledge out of it. Now, when you go over to Adobe, you can find two types of Lightrooms. You can find Lightroom Desktop and Mobile, which is the newer version, and then you can find Lightroom Classic, which is the one I use. Now, Lightroom Classic is only for computers. You can't use it on your cell phone. Meanwhile, Lightroom Mobile, you can use it on your cell phone and your computer and tablet. Now, the most important thing to notice that differentiates these two programs is the workflow. Meanwhile, Lightroom, the new version, requires you to have a subscription to Adobe Cloud, so all your files are saved in the cloud all the time, allowing you to work seamlessly between editing a photo in your tablet and then transferring it to your phone or computer. Lightroom Classic is a more older version, so you can arrange and search for your files within your computer or your SDs or memory cards. So let's jump into Lightroom and start with this basic tutorial, guys. Now, when you open up Lightroom Classic on your computer, guys, you have this layout. It opens up on Library. Library is where you're going to organize and find all your files and all your photos. You can import them and export them and arrange them. So basically, this is your home setting. Then you have the Develop tab, which is where I edit or where you edit all your values on your photography. And then you have all these map, books, slideshow, print, and web, which really I haven't even opened them. I don't really use them. So basically, we're going to go through what I consider to be essential in Lightroom. So in this case, we're just going to start off by importing our photos. Just going to hit import, and then we're going to select here all the folders that we want to import. So in this case, I'm just going to go all the way to my SD. So once you found the files or the folder that you want to import, here you can check mark which ones you want to import. So I'm just going to uncheck them and just import a few of them, and then we can hit import. Now, as we can see over here in folders, we can see the files that we have imported. We can select them just like by clicking on them. And here in Library, we have several tools that help us to arrange and to choose which photos that we want to edit. So for starters, we can select them, and with 1 to 5 on our keyboard, we can rate them with 1 or 5 stars. Here we can rate with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That will depend on which image you consider to be the best quality. Then, if the rating isn't enough, you can differentiate them with the colors. So we can select these ones, which are very similar photographs of the same photograph. So with 6 to 9 on our keyboard, we can assign a color to them. So for example, 6 is red, 7 is yellow, 8 is green, and 9 is blue. Now we can see that these images are in blue, so we can differentiate them from the others. And finally, let's say we look at these images, we can move them, we can make them a bit bigger, and we decide that this one is going to be the one that we're going to edit. So we can flag it by clicking on the little flag over here, and now this is the one that we're going to edit. So basically, that's a way you can differentiate and organize your files in Lightroom Classic. So down here we have another tab where we can see the library or the images selected, and here as well we can see the little flag, the rating, and the colors that differentiate them from the others. So let's start off by editing this one. We're going to select it and go to the Develop tab. Now, this edit is going to be quite simple. I'm just going to go through all the values, basically what I do or what each value does, so you have a better knowledge of what everything does, guys. So for starters, we can see that down here we have still the library open, so we can seamlessly move from one image to another. We can do it by selecting them or just by moving with the arrows left or right to edit the next image, guys. Now on the left, we have this tab over here. We have the Collections tab where you can basically put different images from different imports into one collection. So we go over to the Library tab. We can see all these images from different folders that are grouped together in a collection down here. You can simply add another collection by selecting this plus button. But over to the Develop tab, once again, guys, we have that over here. And then we have the History tab, which basically tells us all the movements that we've done. I don't really use it, or the snapshot one. Then we have the presets tab over here where we can save our own presets, or we can load any preset that we've downloaded by selecting this little tab down here and importing the presets. And on the right, we have our main editing tab down here, guys. Now, as you can see, the editing tab has several little tabs that compose it. First of all, we have the basic corrections over here, which control the exposure, the white balancing, and the overall presence of the image. Then up here, we have all the tools for retouching. Then we have the tone curve, HSL, which is where we will do all the color grading and in split toning. then detail, and we're going to go over all of these guys one by one. Let's start off with the basic corrections. Now the first thing that we do with an image is make sure it's correctly white balanced. So we can do that with the temperature and the tint sliders. Now sometimes when you're on field you didn't have the time to correctly set the white balance, so here you can correct it by moving the sliders of the temperature and the tint up. Now a quick tip, if you don't like to move around the sliders, you can always just select selector down here and select anything in the image that you know is white. So in this case we don't have anything, but just for purposes of example, let's select this part, and as we can see immediately it auto compensates the values of temperature and tint. So in this case it's not correct because the part that I selected isn't white, but it's a tool you can use for portraits or for any kind of photography, guys. Now first of all, we have all these sliders in the basic corrections. We can obviously move the slider up or down to alter the value, or we can type in the number down here to be a bit more precise. And finally we have another option, which is by right clicking on the name of the exposure with plus and negative on our keyboard, we can move the values by a smaller percent. Okay, so exposure and contrast will alter the overall exposure and contrast of the image. Basically I don't really move these. These are two basic corrections that you can do in any app. What I like to do is move the highlights, shadows, whites and blacks. Now blacks and shadows aren't the same, guys. Now blacks control these parts of the image, the ones that are really dark. You can see if we move the blacks up, these parts of the image light up. But the shadows move, let's say not the darkest parts of our image, but still the ones leaning towards the dark side. So if we move this one up, we can see that lighter parts of our image start moving. The same applies with whites and highlights. The whites control the brightest parts of our image, meanwhile the highlights control around the midtones. Now if you shoot raw, this image has a lot more detail and a lot more information than JPEGs. So what I like to do is ump up the shadows, and as we can see, parts that are of the image that were underexposed are suddenly with a lot more information. So I ump it up, and then I return the contrast or the blacks just a bit all the way down, so we don't lose all that contrast that we had initially, guys. Then I do basically the same thing with the highlights. I pull them down, the opposite, and then the whites I'm just pulling it up to achieve a little bit more contrast. Now you can do this, or you can achieve this with the exposure and contrast, but it's not going to be so precise, guys. Then texture, clarity and the haze. Basically this is a very stylized look. For example, if we ump up the texture, we can see that everything looks a bit more sharp. It's not good to overdo it, guys, as it does become a little bit more unrealistic. And clarity does something of the same, but with a lot less detail. It just adds a lot more contrast into the images. Now the haze, basically the name says it, it removes the haze from the image, or it adds it. It's not to be overdone as well, otherwise the image starts to be a bit more towards the ghosting side effect. And finally we have vibrance and saturation, which obviously desaturates the image in general. Now up here in the retouching tabs, we have this one, which is crop, and basically here we can assign any aspect ratio to the image. So for example, for vertical images on Instagram, I like to go with a 4:5, which is the maximum vertical size that Instagram allows. And then I'm just going to crop it and center it just like that, guys. Then again, here in crop we have this tool, which is very useful, the angle. Particularly when you shoot in landscapes, you want your image to be completely horizontal, guys. You don't want it to be tilted towards the side. So with angle, you can basically draw a line, for example in a street, and it automatically corrects the image towards the upright position. While we're up here, guys, we have the other retouching tools. We have the spot removal, which basically allows you to remove pimples or imperfections on the image. Let's say we wanted to remove the text from this part of the image, the 56, we can select the retouching tool and basically select it over here, and then we can remove certain aspects of the image for retouching purposes, guys. Then we have the red eye correction, basically for flash purposes, and then a very important one is the gradient filter and the radial filter, which basically do the same thing but with different shapes. For example, the gradient filter, if we wanted to darken this part of the image, the higher part, we can just create a gradient, add the values down here. This tab appears for the gradient. For example, we can pull the exposure down or put it up, and then we can just drag it to the point that everything that we want to illuminate is in the gradient, just like that, guys. Or we can even darken it or change the temperature of this part of the image. So these tools allow you to select and edit certain parts of the image, as well as the brush tool. The brush tool is very important. So for example, for portraits of dogs and of people, I always like to use the brush tool to highlight certain parts of the image. So I just zoom in just a little bit, select the brush tool, and then I just add a little bit more exposure and clarity, and then I'm just going to color the parts of the image that I want to highlight or really make pop up. And basically those are the correction tools up here, which are very useful, guys, but I always leave to the last after I completed the color grading and the basic corrections. Next up, tone curve. So this is a tone curve, guys, and it has the same purpose as the basic correction, but you get a little bit more freedom, and also you get another layer. So basically you did a basic correction over here in the contrast, and here you can add a little bit more another layer to the contrast selection. So down here we have the blacks, up here we have the whites, and we can move the blacks up just like that, and then we can see that all the blacks basically disappear from the image. And here we can move the whites down, and basically all the whites disappear from the image. So this is a simple way to explain what we did up here. If we put a point over here and a point over here, this is the whites, this is highlights, then we go over to the shadows and the blacks. So basically the blacks control the darkest parts of our image, the shadows the midtones, and the highlights control the midtones in the highlight reel, and then the whites control the whitest parts of our image. So basically we can add any points that we want to the tone curve, and here we can alter certain parts of our image. So in this case, what I want to do is just make the blacks a little bit more faded, and for that I'm just going to create a point down here, point over here. I'm going to move this point of the blacks up, and as we can see, the blacks on our image are tending towards the more grayish tones or more faded out look. So that's how you achieve a faded look in the blacks. Now if you wanted to make a bit of a more contrasty shape, we can always use the S shape. So for example, we can pull down the shadows, and we can pull up the highlights just like this, and as we can see, the image has a lot more contrast than it initially had. Now another shape that's very common is the underexposed curve down here, the U shape. You can pull the highlights down, the shadows down just like that, and as you can see, the image is very underexposed now, it's very flat. So that's another way you can edit, guys. Now there's some shortcuts on your keyboard that are very helpful. For example, F allows you to isolate the image so you can view it in full screen. Then you have Y on your keyboard, which allows you to see the before and after in comparison view just like that. And here we can see the changes that we've done. Okay, next up, the HSL and the color grading in general, guys. Now here we have three tabs, guys. We have the hue, which allows you to change the color of specific colors towards another tone. Then we have the saturation, which basically, well, the saturation of each color, and then the luminance. Now here in hue, you can change the colors to the approximate next one in the tone curve. So for example, if you want to change the greens, you can move them towards the yellowish over here. It makes it look more like an autumn. And then you can change it to the other side, which change them towards the emerald artificial kind of green. So basically that's what you can do with every color. Just play around with it. Then in saturation, well, for example, the greens, we want to desaturate them completely. Here they're basically gone. And then in luminance, we can add some luminance to that color to make it pop, or to darken it and make it less obvious, guys. So for example, if you wanted the greens to pop up a lot more, you can just amp up the luminance of the greens just like that, a bit of the yellows and the aquas, and the greens start to pop up just a little bit more. If we do it to the opposite side, they turn towards the darkish tones, and they're a lot less obvious and prominent, guys. So basically play around with these factors. This is basically gonna define your color grading. And then we have split toning to complement what we did up here. Down here in split toning, what we have is basically adding a color to the highlights and the shadows. So for example, if we wanted to go for a teal and orange look, in the shadows we want to add some teal-like color. So in this case, I'm just going to move this tab, the hue tab, all the way down here, but I don't know with what color we're working. So we're going to select Alt on our keyboard while we slide this slider up or down, and here we can see the full saturation of the color. So in this case, we want something around this color, more tealish, and then we can move the slider of the saturation to whatever value that we want. Now the highlights is basically the same. This time I'm going to go with the orangey type color, just like that, move the saturation up. So basically split toning, what it does is divide the image into highlights and shadows. There's no middle tones or anything in the middle. So here you can control the balance with this one image to be tending towards the shadows. So the shadow colors is going to be a lot more prominent, or towards the highlights, where the yellows that we assigned are going to be a lot more strong, guys. Okay, so next up, guys, we leave the color gradient behind and we go into the detail tab. Now detail tab is very useful, guys. For example, this image, if we zoom in, we can see that there's a lot of noise, guys. Basically this image was shot with a higher ISO of 1000, and an APS-C sensor camera's ISO is very prominent and the noise is very strong, guys. So here we have noise reduction and then we have sharpening. Now for noise reduction, I just like to move the luminance just a bit, and as we can see, the noise has basically disappeared from the image and it's a lot more clean. Now it's not to be overdone, otherwise this image tends to be a bit more plasticky, so just leave it around the 30% and the noise is basically gone, but it's still not unrealistic. Now let's say that on field you didn't nail the focus, but you really like this image, but you want to sharpen it and make it a lot more crisp, so you go to the sharpening and just add a bit more sharpening to your image to make it a lot more crisp that it originally was. Now next up, lens corrections. Now all lenses have their flaws. There's no perfect lens. They all have, whether it be vignetting, pincushioning, distortions, chromatic aberration, all those things are real things, and the companies of the lenses are aware of that. So basically, if you enable lens corrections, Lightroom will automatically select the lens which your camera shot the image and correct all the values that are flaws in the image. So we can select it on and off. Basically, we can see that this image had some pincushioning, distortion, and some vignetting. We can see that the borders of the image are a lot more bright now, and the center of the image is a lot more big. So basically, that's lens corrections, guys. It automatically corrects the flaws of your lens. Next up, transform. Well, transform basically is just altering the values or the physics of the image. So basically, for example, you can make the image a lot more tilted towards one side, rotate it, scale it, all those things. You can obviously just select auto and the image will be automatically corrected. And then, guys, if we keep scrolling down, we have the effects, and the effects tab is quite unique. It allows you to add a little bit more stylized look. So first up, we have the post-crop vignetting, and here we can add it positive to make it white, to make it look like an old portrait, or negative to make it dark. So basically what I like to do is put it at -100 and start editing the vignette. So for example, I like to feather it. If you go to the minus feather, it basically looks like this, and then you can feather it all the way to the 100 to make it more seamless. Then roundness, well, basically how round you want the vignette to be. Midpoint, how deep you want it to go into the image. So in this case, not too much, just like that. And then I just return the amount to whatever value I want, just like that. Then another aspect that's very important, or at least for me, is the grain. So you can add some grain to make a little bit more texture in the image. Now grain is different to noise, just remember that. And here you can alter the size and also the roughness, as well as the overall amount of the grain. So it just adds a little bit more texture. It's a little thing, guys, not too much, otherwise it's too distracting for the viewer. And then finally, guys, we have camera calibration, and camera calibration basically alters the original colors that come from your camera, the basic colors, which the colors of the image are composed. So we have the primary green, red, and blue. And what I like to do, particularly in portraits, let's see if we can find a portrait over here. So you have this portrait over here, and what I like to do is move the camera calibration, the greens up, the primary greens, and here we can see how, if we move them up, the saturation, how the skin tones really pop a lot more, guys. So basically, that's a way you can emphasize your subject, particularly in skin tones, to get very rich skin tones, and particularly when the model is blushed or has a red spots on their face or in the body in general, it really makes them pop a lot more, guys. So play around with these factors. Again, it's not to be overdone. And basically, that's all the things that you have to keep in mind when you're editing, guys. I know it seems like there's a lot of tabs, but just go through them while editing and you'll notice that it's quite simple to edit and create final results, guys. Now finally, maybe you're happy with this edit and you want to apply it to other images. You can do it by several manners, but the two that I use the most is right-clicking, settings, and copy settings, and then we can select all the settings that we want to copy to the other image, and then we move to the next image. So in this case, I'm just going to move to this one, let's say, and then we're going to right-click, settings again, and paste the settings. And as we can see, the settings are now pasted, the same settings that we applied in the previous image. Another way to do it, if you want to save this edit or this style to apply it on different images, you can go all the way here to the presets tab, select the plus sign, create a preset and name it, and then basically you can create it. And down here on the user preset, you have your presets, and you can apply them to any kind of image in any time, guys, in the further future. So basically the thing that remains is the export, guys. So let's say this image is ready to post on Instagram or to print or anything. Just right click it, export, and you can export it. Now here you can select what you want to export it on your computer. And finally, what I like to do, or what I always do, is amp up the quality 100% always, and the pixels nothing below 300 pixels per inch, and then you can hit export. And basically that's all, guys. So guys, that's basically all I use in Lightroom. Hopefully it helps you to start off. And remember, the most important thing is to practice. There's no use in watching tutorial after tutorial if you're not going to open up Lightroom and edit your photos. So practice, take some photos, edit, guys, all the time, and soon you're going to be very good at editing, guys. So guys, that's going to be it for this video. But before that, just a reminder that you can support me in various manners. You can buy my presets, you can join the channel as a member, or you can simply buy some merch down here. But if you did like the video, can you please give it a like? It really makes a difference, and consider subscribing. Hit the notification bell to be notified when I upload the next video. I'm Tony Fuentes. Hope you're doing well. Cheers to all of you, and see you in the next one.